On a rainy night, a mysterious stranger stands alone, drenched and desperate, until a kind family opens their door and their hearts. A struggling man's secret threatens to shatter the trust of the family who saved him. But as they uncover the truth, an act of kindness sparks a fight for justice that changes their lives forever. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. The Johnson family lived in a small but lively urban neighborhood. Marcus, a retired teacher known for his unwavering sense of justice, spent his days volunteering at the community center. His wife, Angela, balanced her role as a community organizer with running the household, while their teenage daughter, Mia, brimmed with youthful energy and ambition, always seeking ways to help others. Despite financial struggles, their home was filled with warmth, laughter, and a deep commitment to their values. One cold, rainy evening, Marcus noticed a man standing in the shadows outside a diner. He was tall but slouched, his clothes worn and damp from the drizzle. His face, partially hidden beneath the brim of a cap, bore the lines of someone who had faced countless hardships. Marcus felt a pang of compassion for the stranger, whose weary eyes darted nervously, as though he were deciding whether to step inside or disappear into the night. The man's name was Caleb, though Marcus didn't know it yet. Caleb had been turned away from the local shelter earlier that day, his quiet demeanor mistaken for trouble. Hunger gnawed at him, but the thought of entering the diner filled him with unease. He wasn't used to being noticed and feared any attention might bring more harm than help. Marcus approached, his kind smile disarming Caleb's guarded posture. "You look like you could use a warm meal," he said, his tone gentle yet firm. Caleb hesitated, shifting on his feet as though weighing whether to trust the stranger. After a moment, he nodded silently, following Marcus into the diner. Inside, the bright lights and the hum of quiet conversation contrasted starkly with Caleb's inner turmoil. He kept his responses short as Marcus tried to make small talk. It wasn't that Caleb was unfriendly. He simply didn't know how to explain the weight he carried. When Marcus asked where he was from, Caleb's answer was vague. He avoided eye contact and clutched a worn photograph in his pocket, a reminder of a life he could never reclaim. Caleb's time at the diner was brief, but it left an impression on Marcus. Seeing the man's reluctance to talk and the pain that seemed to shadow him, Marcus couldn't bring himself to send Caleb back into the cold night. "Come home with me," he offered, his voice steady but kind. Caleb immediately shook his head, muttering something about not wanting to be a burden. But Marcus, persistent in his compassion, gently insisted until Caleb gave in with a weary nod. When they arrived at the Johnsons' modest home, Caleb hesitated at the door, his body tense with unease. Angela greeted them with polite but wary curiosity, her eyes flicking between Marcus and their unexpected guest. Mia, usually quick to welcome anyone, seemed quieter, studying Caleb as if trying to read the story he wasn't telling. Marcus explained the situation briefly, reassuring his family that it was only for a few nights. Though hesitant, Angela and Mia trusted Marcus's judgment and agreed to make Caleb feel as welcome as possible. Despite their best efforts, Caleb's unease lingered. At dinner, he barely spoke, avoiding their warm questions about his interests or background. He seemed more comfortable doing things for the family than talking with them. Early the next morning, before anyone else had woken up, Caleb was already outside fixing a loose step on the porch. His hands worked with practiced precision, revealing a familiarity with tools that hinted at a past trade or skill. Yet every time a car drove by or a distant siren wailed, Caleb would flinch, his head turning sharply as though expecting trouble. The family began to notice small but telling details. Caleb always carried a folded, faded photograph in his pocket. One evening, when he thought no one was watching, Mia caught a glimpse of it. A smiling woman with 2 young children. Caleb's hand trembled as he quickly tucked it away, his expression a mix of sorrow and longing. Angela, observing his behavior, wondered aloud to Marcus what kind of loss Caleb might be carrying. "He's not just running from something," she said. "He's running from himself." Their quiet concern for Caleb wasn't shared by everyone. A few neighbors, particularly Mr. Lawrence, voiced their disapproval. "You don't know who he is or what he's done," Lawrence warned Marcus one afternoon. "People like that don't just end up on the streets without a reason." Marcus brushed off the comments, but the weight of community judgment began to seep into the family's lives. Angela overheard whispers at the grocery store, and Mia's friends asked questions she didn't have answers to. Caleb, sensing the growing tension, withdrew further. One night, while sitting alone on the back porch, Marcus joined him. "You don't have to say anything, Caleb," Marcus said softly, "but whatever you've been through, you don't have to face it alone." Caleb looked down at his hands, rough and calloused, and shook his head. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice heavy with regret. "I don't deserve this, any of it." Caleb, despite his guarded demeanor, found small ways to contribute around the house. He repaired squeaky hinges, tightened loose pipes, and even fixed Angela's old sewing machine, all without being asked. These gestures didn't go unnoticed, especially by Mia, who began spending more time with him. At first, their conversations were sparse, but over time, Caleb started sharing glimpses of his past. Not in details, but in life lessons wrapped in quiet wisdom. One afternoon, Mia sat on the porch struggling to assemble a birdhouse for a school project. Caleb watched for a moment before silently kneeling beside her. "Your measurements are off," he said softly, taking the ruler from her hand and showing her how to mark the wood properly. Mia was initially annoyed, but soon realized his guidance made the work easier. "How do you know all this?" she asked curiously. Caleb hesitated before replying. "I used to build things for a living a long time ago." Their bond grew as Mia began seeking his advice on other projects and even school dilemmas. Caleb's insight surprised her. His understanding of human nature and his ability to see solutions beyond the obvious made her see him in a new light. Yet, for every answer he gave, there was a question he dodged, reinforcing the air of mystery surrounding him. Not everyone was as willing to see past Caleb's guarded nature. Mr. Lawrence, a nosy neighbor with a penchant for gossip, became increasingly suspicious. One evening, he stopped Marcus outside the house, his tone a mix of concern and accusation. "I've seen that man before," Lawrence insisted. "I'm telling you he's trouble. There was a news story a while back about someone who looks just like him. A man connected to some kind of crime." Marcus, though unsettled by Lawrence's claims, refused to act on hearsay. "People deserve the chance to prove who they are, not be judged by who they might be," he replied firmly, walking away. But the seed of doubt was planted, and as much as Marcus wanted to dismiss it, he couldn't shake the feeling that Caleb might be hiding more than he let on. Unbeknownst to Marcus, Caleb overheard the conversation from an open window. That night, he sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the photograph he carried everywhere. His face was a storm of emotions, guilt, fear, and a deep sadness he could no longer suppress. By dawn, Caleb was gone. He left behind the photograph and a hastily written note on the kitchen table. Asterisk, "I don't want to bring harm to your family. Thank you for everything." Asterisk, when the Johnsons found the note, it was as though the air had been knocked out of the room. Mia clutched the photograph, studying the faces of the smiling family. "We can't just let him go," she said, her voice trembling. Angela, torn between worry for her family's safety and compassion for Caleb, looked to Marcus for guidance. "We have two choices," Marcus said, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. "We can let him walk away, or we can find him and learn the truth, whatever it may be." As the family sat in silence, the sound of rain began to fall outside, mirroring the storm of uncertainty that now surrounded them. The Johnson household felt emptier without Caleb's quiet presence. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they had failed him by letting him slip away. He spent the next few days retracing Caleb's steps, asking around at the diner, the shelter, and even the local hardware store where Caleb had once mentioned stopping. Most people had seen him briefly, but didn't know where he had gone. Marcus's determination to find Caleb was unshaken. "He deserves a second chance," he told Angela one evening, his voice resolute. "Whatever he's running from, it's not who he is now." Meanwhile, Caleb wandered the streets, seeking refuge in the anonymity of the city. He avoided well-lit areas and kept his head low, haunted by memories he couldn't escape. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same scene replaying: a construction site, a deafening crash, and the faces of a family he once knew. The tragedy had left scars deeper than any accusation or judgment. Caleb had been blamed, his reputation destroyed, and the guilt had consumed him ever since. At night, he found shelter under bridges or in abandoned buildings, clutching the memory of the photograph he had left behind. Without it, he felt even more adrift, as though he had severed his last tie to the life he once had. The kindness of the Johnsons lingered in his mind, but Caleb couldn't accept it. To him, their generosity was misplaced, wasted on someone like him. Back at home, Angela faced the growing judgment of their community. A rumor had started spreading that the Johnsons had harbored a dangerous man. Whispers at the grocery store turned into cold stares and outright questions. "How could you let someone like that into your home?" a neighbor asked Angela, shaking her head in disbelief. Angela's confidence in their decision began to waver. "What if we made a mistake, Marcus?" she asked one night, her voice breaking. "What if the neighbors are right, and we put ourselves and Mia in danger?" Mia, however, refused to accept Caleb's departure as the end of the story. Determined to understand who he was, she began researching online. She searched for anything she could find about Caleb, construction accidents, or unresolved legal cases. After hours of digging, she found a lead, a news article about a building collapse from several years ago. The article mentioned a man named Caleb Morris, a construction foreman accused of negligence that led to the tragedy. He had disappeared after the charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. As Mia read the article aloud to her parents, the pieces began to fit. Caleb's knowledge of tools, his avoidance of police, the guilt in his eyes. It all pointed to this chapter of his past. But the article also mentioned something else. Allegations that the construction company had cut corners to save money, ignoring Caleb's warnings about safety. "This isn't over," Marcus said, his resolve deepening. "If Caleb's out there, he needs to know someone believes in him. We have to find him before it's too late." Despite Angela's lingering doubts, she agreed. The family's search for Caleb was no longer just about helping a stranger. It was about uncovering the truth and giving him a chance to reclaim his life. Mia's discovery about Caleb's past lingered heavily in the Johnson household. She spent hours piecing together fragmented stories from old news articles, trying to make sense of the man who had quietly become part of their lives. According to the reports, Caleb had been a foreman at a construction company known for cutting corners. A tragic building collapse had left several families devastated, and while Caleb had been accused of negligence, the charges were dropped when it came to light that the company had ignored his repeated warnings about safety. The scandal, however, had already ruined Caleb's reputation. The media had painted him as reckless, and even after the charges were cleared, no one wanted to hire him. Mia shared these findings with her parents, her voice trembling as she spoke. He wasn't guilty, but he paid the price anyway. He lost everything: his job, his home, his family. The realization deepened the Johnsons' understanding of Caleb's pain. Angela, meanwhile, began seeing Caleb's impact in unexpected places. At the community shelter where she worked, she overheard a conversation between two regulars about a man who had been helping them quietly. "He fixed the sink in the bathroom and didn't ask for anything in return," one man said. Another chimed in, "Yeah, he even showed me how to patch up my jacket. Said I could take care of it myself next time." Angela's curiosity was piqued. "Who are you talking about?" she asked. When they described a tall, quiet man with kind eyes, Angela knew it was Caleb. Despite his own struggles, he had found ways to help others, proving that his character was far from the accusations that had once defined him. Her perspective began to shift. Angela had been hesitant about Marcus's insistence on finding Caleb, torn between her family's safety and the desire to do the right thing. But now, she saw that Caleb wasn't just someone in need of help. He was someone who, despite everything, still tried to make the world around him better. While Angela and Mia uncovered more about Caleb's true nature, Marcus had his own confrontation to face. Mr. Lawrence's accusations still hung in the air, casting a shadow over Caleb's time with the Johnsons. Marcus decided to confront him directly. He found Lawrence tending to his garden one afternoon. "You've been spreading rumors about Caleb," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. "What makes you so sure he's a danger to anyone?" Lawrence stiffened, his hands gripping the garden shears. "I know his type," he said. "People don't end up on the streets unless they've done something to deserve it. Do you know him?" Marcus pressed. "Do you know his story? Or are you just assuming because it's easier than showing compassion?" Lawrence avoided Marcus's gaze, but his silence spoke volumes. Marcus continued, his voice steady. "I won't let bias or fear decide what kind of man Caleb is. He deserves a chance to prove himself, just like anyone else." The exchange only strengthened Marcus's resolve. Caleb wasn't just a stranger. They had welcomed him into their lives, and now they understood the weight he carried. Marcus returned home more determined than ever to find Caleb and give him the support he needed to rebuild his life. With every new piece of information, the Johnsons felt their connection to Caleb deepening. They were no longer just trying to help a man in need. They were fighting to restore his humanity in a world that had unfairly stripped it away. The Johnsons' search for Caleb was relentless. Marcus scoured familiar places, while Angela reached out to her contacts at the shelter. It was Mia who finally found him, sitting alone in a park beneath a canopy of bare winter trees. He looked thinner, his face more haggard than when they had first met, but his expression was the same, a mixture of weariness and guilt. "Caleb," Mia called softly as she approached. He looked up, startled, his eyes narrowing as he recognized her. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We've been looking for you," she replied, her voice trembling. "You left, but we're not giving up on you." Caleb shook his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I left for a reason. You don't understand. You shouldn't have come." But Marcus and Angela weren't far behind. They approached with careful steps, not wanting to overwhelm him. "We know about what happened," Marcus said, his tone gentle. "We know you tried to warn them about the building. It wasn't your fault." Caleb's face hardened at the words, and he stood abruptly. "You don't know everything," he said sharply, his voice cracking. "I didn't just try to warn them. I gave up." The family froze, the weight of his words sinking in. Caleb sat back down, burying his face in his hands. Slowly, he pulled out a second photograph from his jacket pocket, one he hadn't shown anyone before. It was the same family from the picture he'd left behind, but this time, the image was crumpled and torn at the edges. "They lived in one of the apartments," Caleb began, his voice barely above a whisper. "The mother, Jennifer, used to bring her kids to the site to watch the workers. She said it made them dream of what their own home could look like one day. I promised her it would be safe. When the company started cutting corners, I fought back at first. I wrote reports. I argued, but..." He paused, his voice breaking. "When they threatened to fire me, I backed down. I let them silence me, and the next thing I knew, that building came down." They didn't make it out. Tears streamed down his face as he gripped the photograph tightly. "I didn't just lose my job or my home. I lost my soul, and I've been running from that ever since." The Johnsons were silent, the emotional weight of Caleb's confession hanging heavily in the air. Angela finally knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You can't keep punishing yourself for what happened," she said softly. "You tried to stop it. You made mistakes, but you weren't the one who put profits over safety." Caleb shook his head. I could have done more. I should have done more. That's why you have to stop running, Marcus said, stepping closer. If you keep hiding, you'll never be able to make it right. But we can help you. We can face this together. For the first time, Caleb allowed himself to cry openly, the walls he had built around his heart crumbling. The Johnsons sat with him, offering words of support and reassurance. Slowly, Caleb began to believe that redemption might be possible. But as the family returned home, their renewed hope was shattered by the sight of flashing red and blue lights. 2 police cars were parked outside, officers waiting on the porch. The neighbors stood in small clusters, watching the scene unfold with murmurs and pointed stares. What's going on? Marcus asked as he stepped forward, shielding Caleb instinctively. One of the officers stepped forward. We received a tip about Mr. Caleb Morris. He's wanted for questioning in connection to the building collapse incident years ago. Caleb's face went pale, and he took a step back. Marcus placed a firm hand on his shoulder. We're not going to let you face this alone, he said firmly. The tension was palpable as the officers moved closer, their expressions unreadable. Caleb glanced at the Johnsons, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. Whatever happens, he said quietly, thank you for everything. The Johnsons exchanged determined glances, knowing the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but resolute in their decision to stand by Caleb no matter what. The tension outside the Johnsons' home was nearly unbearable. Neighbors whispered and stared as the police stood on the porch, their serious expressions making Caleb brace for the worst. But the officer who had stepped forward held up his hand in a calming gesture. Mr. Morris, the officer began, you're not under arrest. We're here because the building collapse case has been reopened. New evidence has come to light, and your testimony as a witness is crucial. The words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. His first instinct was to run, to disappear again into the shadows where no one could find him. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he looked down, his breathing shallow. Why now? He muttered. Why after all this time? The officer explained. A whistleblower from the construction company has come forward with internal documents. They confirm that the company ignored multiple safety warnings, including some filed by you. The case isn't just about the victims anymore. It's about exposing the people who were truly responsible. Caleb felt a knot tightening in his chest. He had fought so hard to bury the past, to keep it from consuming him, and now it was being dragged into the light. He glanced at the Johnsons, who stood silently behind him. Their presence was steadying, but the fear of facing public scrutiny again was overwhelming. I can't do it, Caleb said firmly, stepping back. I've already lived through the judgment, the accusations. I can't go through it all again. Marcus stepped forward, his voice calm but insistent. Caleb, listen to me. You've carried this weight for too long. You can't keep running from it. This isn't just about you, it's about the truth. The victims, their families, they deserve justice. And you deserve the chance to clear your name. Caleb shook his head, his voice rising in frustration. You don't understand. They'll tear me apart in court, in the media. Even if I tell the truth, no one's going to believe me. They never did before. You're not the same man you were back then, Marcus said, his tone unwavering. You've faced your mistakes, and you've tried to make amends in your own way. This is your chance to do it on a bigger scale, to stand up to the people who tried to silence you. Angela stepped beside Marcus, her voice soft but resolute. You said you couldn't save that family, but by speaking out now, you might save others. You could be the voice that stops this from happening again. Caleb looked at Mia, who had been silent through the exchange. She met his gaze with determination. You told me once that it's never too late to do the right thing, she said quietly. This is your chance to prove it, to yourself and to everyone else. The weight of their words settled on Caleb's shoulders. He looked back at the officers, who were waiting patiently, then at the neighbors who were watching with suspicion. Finally, his gaze returned to the Johnsons, who stood by him with unwavering support. Taking a deep breath, Caleb nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." The officers explained that Caleb would need to come to the station to give a formal statement and prepare for a potential court appearance. As they left, Caleb turned to Marcus. "Why are you doing this for me?" Marcus placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Because we believe in second chances. And because the truth matters, no matter how long it takes." For the first time in years, Caleb felt a spark of hope. A fragile but powerful flicker that maybe, just maybe, he could face the past and finally find peace. The days that followed Caleb's decision to testify were a whirlwind of preparation, reflection, and unease. Marcus took charge of helping Caleb recount his memories from the time of the collapse, encouraging him to face the details he had long buried. Caleb's initial reluctance gave way to a quiet determination as the Johnsons rallied around him. Angela, ever resourceful, reached out to her network of activists and legal advocates. She contacted a local lawyer, Ms. Renee Carter, known for her work in defending victims of corporate negligence. Ms. Carter agreed to take Caleb's case, recognizing the significance of exposing the systemic corruption that had led to the tragedy. "This isn't just about clearing your name," Ms. Carter said firmly during their first meeting. "This is about holding people accountable for the lives they destroyed. You've been a victim of their lies, Caleb, but you also have the power to make this right." Caleb nodded, though his hands trembled slightly as he clasped them in his lap. "I'll try," he said quietly. "I don't know if I'm strong enough, but I'll try." Mia became his constant source of encouragement. She spent hours sitting with him at the kitchen table, going over documents and timelines. Her youthful optimism clashed with Caleb's cautious outlook, but her persistence began to break through his walls. "Do you realize how many people you're going to help by doing this?" Mia asked one evening as they reviewed the company's safety reports. If someone had spoken up like this before, maybe that family. She hesitated, glancing at the photograph Caleb kept near him. Maybe they would still be here. "You're making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Her words stayed with Caleb long after their conversation ended. For years, he had defined himself by his failures, but the Johnsons saw something more in him, a man who could still make a difference. As the investigation gained traction, new evidence surfaced, including emails and internal memos that confirmed Caleb had repeatedly warned his supervisors about the structural issues. The tide began to turn in his favor, but the exposure of the company's corruption brought unwanted attention. Anonymous threats started arriving. Phone calls in the middle of the night, notes left on the windshield of Marcus's car. "Stay out of this," one note warned. "You don't know who you're messing with." Angela was shaken but resolute. "This only proves we're doing the right thing," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "They're scared because they know the truth is coming out." Caleb, however, felt a pang of guilt. "I didn't mean to bring this trouble to your family," he said one evening, his voice thick with emotion. "Maybe it's better if I step away. They're targeting you because of me." Marcus wouldn't hear of it. "We knew the risks when we decided to help you," he said firmly. "We don't back down from what's right, no matter how hard it gets." The threats only strengthened their resolve. Angela organized a community meeting, gathering supporters who believed in Caleb's innocence and wanted to stand against the injustices that had plagued their neighborhood. "This isn't just Caleb's fight," she told them. "It's about all of us refusing to let greed and corruption destroy our lives." With the Johnsons' unwavering support, Caleb began to find a new sense of purpose. He no longer saw himself as a man running from his past, but as someone capable of confronting it head-on. When he finally walked into the courtroom to give his testimony, he carried not only the weight of his regrets, but also the strength of the family who had given him hope. Yet, even as the case moved forward, the danger loomed larger. The people who had orchestrated the cover-up were powerful, and they weren't willing to let the truth come out without a fight. The Johnsons braced themselves for the storm ahead, knowing that their journey with Caleb was far from over. The night was quiet when Caleb stepped out for some air. The tension of the last few weeks had been weighing heavily on him, and he often found solace in the stillness of the Johnsons' backyard. He leaned against the porch railing, staring at the stars and wondering if he had made the right decision in staying. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his thoughts. Before he could turn, a rough hand grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. Two men stood in the shadows, their faces partially obscured but their intent clear. One of them hissed, "You should have stayed hidden, Morris. You're making things harder for everyone." Caleb's heart pounded as they closed in. His instinct was to retreat, but he stood his ground, refusing to let fear control him anymore. "I'm not running," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "You want to stop me? You'll have to do it in the open." One of the men sneered. "That can be arranged." Before they could act, the screen door creaked open and Marcus stepped out. His eyes immediately took in the scene, and without hesitation, he placed himself between Caleb and the intruders. "If you've got a problem, you'll have to go through me," he said firmly. The men exchanged glances, momentarily thrown off by Marcus's calm but unyielding demeanor. "You don't know what you're protecting," one of them said. "This isn't your fight." Marcus squared his shoulders. "It became my fight the moment Caleb walked into my life. I don't care who you are or who you're working for. You're not going to stop us." The tension in the air was electric. Caleb, emboldened by Marcus's courage, stepped forward. "I've spent years running from people like you," he said, his voice gaining strength. "But not anymore. If you think you can scare me back into silence, you're wrong." The men advanced, but Marcus lunged at one, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him away. The struggle was chaotic. Punches thrown in the dim light, the sound of scuffling feet echoing through the yard. Caleb hesitated for a moment, memories of his past failures flashing before him. But then he saw Marcus struggling, refusing to back down despite being outnumbered. And something inside him shifted. With a burst of determination, Caleb charged at the second man, catching him off guard. They grappled, and Caleb fought with a fierceness he didn't know he possessed. The fear that had paralyzed him for years melted away, replaced by a sense of purpose and defiance. The commotion drew Angela and Mia to the door. Angela shouted for the men to leave, her voice cutting through the chaos, while Mia called the police. The sound of approaching sirens finally forced the attackers to retreat, disappearing into the night as quickly as they had appeared. Marcus staggered to his feet, bruised but unharmed. He looked at Caleb, who was breathing heavily but standing tall, a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You okay?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with concern. Caleb nodded, wiping a trickle of blood from his lip. "I am now," he said, his voice steady. The family gathered around Caleb, their presence a source of comfort and strength. Despite the ordeal, they all knew this was a turning point. Caleb had faced his fears head-on, and the Johnsons had shown once again that they were willing to fight for him, no matter the cost. When the police arrived, Caleb and Marcus recounted the attack, while Angela and Mia stood by their sides. The officers promised to increase patrols in the area, but the family knew the threats wouldn't stop. The corrupt forces behind the company were growing desperate, and the court date loomed closer with every passing day. That night, as they sat together in the living room, Caleb looked around at the Johnsons, his voice thick with emotion. "You've risked so much for me. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank us," Angela said gently. "You're a part of this family now, Caleb, and family sticks together." For the first time in years, Caleb felt a glimmer of hope, not just for his case, but for the possibility of a future where he wasn't defined by his past mistakes. The road ahead would be tough, but he wasn't walking it alone anymore. The Johnsons had his back, and together, they would face whatever came next. The courtroom was silent as Caleb took the stand, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. The weight of years of guilt, pain, and silence bore down on him. But he stood tall, bolstered by the unwavering support of the Johnsons seated behind him. Marcus gave him a firm nod. Angela clasped her hands in quiet prayer, and Mia offered an encouraging smile. Caleb took a deep breath and began to speak. "My name is Caleb Morris," he said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his throat. For years, I've lived with the belief that I was responsible for a tragedy that destroyed lives. I blamed myself because I thought I should have done more. But today, I stand here not just to clear my name, but to speak the truth about what really happened. He recounted the events leading up to the collapse, his repeated warnings to his supervisors about the structural issues, and the blatant disregard they showed for safety regulations. His voice cracked as he spoke about the families who had suffered and the weight of carrying their loss on his shoulders. I wasn't perfect, Caleb admitted, his eyes meeting the jury. There were things I could have done better, but I wasn't the one who ignored the warnings. I wasn't the one who cut corners to save money at the expense of lives. The people responsible for that are sitting in this room, and they've hidden behind lies and power for far too long. As he spoke, Ms. Carter presented the evidence they had gathered: emails, safety reports, and testimonies from other employees who had witnessed the company's negligence. Each piece painted a damning picture of corruption and greed, shifting the blame squarely onto the executives who had orchestrated the cover-up. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Caleb concluded his testimony. I've carried this burden for so long, believing I didn't deserve a second chance. But there are people who showed me that redemption is possible, that the truth matters. I'm here today because of them. They reminded me that even in the darkest times, there's still hope. The defense attempted to discredit Caleb, pointing to his years of silence and struggles with homelessness. But their arguments fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence and Caleb's heartfelt testimony. When the jury returned with their verdict, the room held its breath. The foreperson announced that the company executives were found guilty of gross negligence and falsifying records. Caleb was officially cleared of any wrongdoing, and the families of the victims were awarded compensation and public apologies. Tears streamed down Caleb's face as the judge dismissed the case. The weight he had carried for years seemed to lift, replaced by a profound sense of relief and gratitude. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him. But Caleb's first words were directed at the Johnsons. Standing before a sea of cameras, he said, "I wouldn't be here today without this family. They didn't know me, but they saw something in me when I couldn't see it in myself. Their faith, their kindness, it saved me. I'll never be able to repay them, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying." Angela reached for his hand, her voice steady as she spoke to the crowd. This isn't just about Caleb. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. We're all capable of making a difference, no matter how small. The scene was raw and emotional, with members of the audience visibly moved. Caleb embraced the Johnsons, his chosen family, as the cameras flashed around them. For the first time in years, Caleb felt a spark of hope for the future. He wasn't the broken man who had wandered into a diner on a rainy night anymore. He was someone with a story of redemption, surrounded by people who believed in him and helped him find his way back to the light. As the sun set on the courthouse steps, Caleb stood surrounded by the Johnsons and a gathering crowd, the weight of the day's events settling into something deeper: purpose. The reporters had dispersed, the courtroom had emptied, but the story wasn't over. For Caleb, this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one built on the lessons he had learned and the unwavering kindness that had guided him here. In the days that followed, Caleb began to outline his vision for a foundation dedicated to helping those wrongfully accused or silenced by powerful systems. He named it the Second Chance Initiative, inspired by the Johnsons and the community support that had helped him reclaim his life. The foundation's mission was clear: to provide legal aid, advocacy, and emotional support to people like him, individuals who had fallen through the cracks but still had so much to offer the world. "I'm not doing this to erase my past," Caleb said during the initiative's first community event. "I'm doing this because of it. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that pain can either break you or become the force that drives you to do better. For me, it's the latter." Angela became an integral part of the foundation, using her connections and experience as a community organizer to build networks of support. Mia, inspired by Caleb's resilience, decided to pursue a career in law, aiming to fight for justice for the voiceless. Marcus took on a quieter but equally impactful role, mentoring young people in the neighborhood, teaching them about empathy, resilience, and the importance of standing up for what's right. One evening, Marcus found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. Sitting on the porch with Caleb, he shared his thoughts. "You know," Marcus began, his voice thoughtful, "when I saw you that night outside the diner, I wasn't sure what I was getting into, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that you needed someone to believe in you. Sometimes, all it takes is one small act of humanity to change someone's path." Caleb nodded, his gaze steady. "It wasn't just the meal or the roof over my head, Marcus. It was the fact that you didn't see me as a lost cause. You and your family gave me a reason to believe I could be something more." Marcus smiled, leaning back in his chair. "That's the thing about kindness. It's contagious. You pass it on, and it creates ripples. Look at what you're doing now. You're taking what you've been through and turning it into something that's going to help so many others. That's what it's all about." The moral of their story resonated deeply within the community and beyond. People were reminded of the power of compassion, the importance of giving others a second chance, and the courage it takes to face one's past. The Johnsons' act of kindness had been a spark, igniting a movement of hope and justice that reached far beyond their neighborhood. Caleb's story became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the profound impact of empathy. As his foundation grew, so did his belief that even in the face of overwhelming odds, change was possible. And at its heart was a lesson that Marcus had instilled in him from the very beginning. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can create the biggest waves. The neighborhood was bustling with life as Caleb walked down the familiar streets, no longer a stranger, but a welcomed member of the community. Children waved to him as they played on the sidewalks. Shopkeepers greeted him with warm smiles, and the Johnsons walked beside him, their bond as strong as family. It was a far cry from the rainy night when Marcus first found Caleb outside the diner, a night that had marked the beginning of a profound transformation. Caleb had found his footing, not just within the community, but within himself. He was no longer the man defined by his past mistakes and burdens. Instead, he was a beacon of hope for others, a living testament to the power of second chances and the strength it took to rebuild a life. The Johnsons, too, had experienced their own journey of growth. The skepticism and criticism they had faced from their neighbors gradually gave way to admiration and support. People saw the ripple effect of their kindness, how one act of compassion had transformed not just Caleb's life, but the entire community. The Johnsons became an example of what it meant to stand by one's principles, even when it wasn't easy. The final scene unfolded at the local shelter, where Caleb had begun volunteering regularly. It was a place that had once turned him away, but now, under Angela's leadership, it had become a haven for those in need. Caleb sat on a bench in the courtyard, a young boy named Jamal beside him. Jamal was shy and reserved, much like Caleb had been when he first met the Johnsons, but there was a spark in his eyes, a glimmer of hope waiting to be nurtured. "You ever feel like the world's against you?" Jamal asked quietly, his small hands gripping a worn basketball. Caleb nodded, a soft smile on his face. "I know that feeling well, but let me tell you something, it doesn't have to stay that way. Sometimes, all it takes is one person believing in you, and when that happens, you start to believe in yourself." Jamal looked up at him, his expression a mix of curiosity and cautious optimism. "You really think things can change?" "I don't just think so," Caleb replied. "I know so. You've got it in you to do great things, Jamal, and I'll be here to help you see that." As the boy smiled for the first time that day, Caleb felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. He saw himself in Jamal, but more importantly, he saw a future where the cycle of kindness and hope continued. From a distance, Marcus, Angela, and Mia watched the interaction, their hearts full of pride. Marcus put an arm around Angela and said, "He's found his purpose. And in doing that, he's given this community something it desperately needed, hope." Angela nodded, wiping a tear from her eye. "We all have. It's amazing what can happen when you choose to see the good in people." The camera panned out, showing Caleb and Jamal laughing together under the warm glow of the setting sun. The shelter's walls were adorned with a new mural, vibrant and hopeful, depicting hands reaching out to lift others up. At the bottom, the words "Kindness creates change" were painted in bold letters, a reminder of the lesson that had guided them all. As the credits rolled, the final image lingered on Caleb, now a symbol of redemption and resilience, mentoring the next generation to carry forward the cycle of kindness. It was a powerful, satisfying closure that left viewers inspired to believe in the transformative power of compassion and second chances.